The motion before us, that the outbreak of the First World War was a deliberate act of German policy rather than a collective failure of crisis management among European powers. Christopher Clark's Sleepwalkers gave us the image of statesmen stumbling into catastrophe, not through malice, but through misperception, system overload, and the compounding of small misjudgments into continental catastrophe. The revisionist scholarship challenges this directly. Germany's military leadership, reading Russia's industrial trajectory and railway expansion, concluded that a European war was inevitable and that every year of delay worsened their position. On this account, July 1914 was not sleepwalking. It was calculation. The distinction is not historical pedantry. It is a question about the structure of catastrophe itself. If wars of this magnitude are accidents, coordination failures among actors who would prefer peace, then better communication, clearer signaling, institutional redesign might prevent the next one. If they are deliberate, undertaken by powers that have decided the alternative is worse, then crisis management is theater. The war comes anyway. We are debating this in 2026 because we are inside a version of it. Great power competition has returned. Military buildups are underway. Spheres of influence are being redrawn. And the question we are actually asking is, when the crisis comes, will it be because we failed to understand each other, or because one side understood perfectly well? At the table, three thinkers whose methods could not be more different. The empiricist approaches every historical claim as a testable proposition and believes most of what we call explanation is pattern matching dressed up as causation. The geographer thinks in terrain, supply lines, and the physical constraints that shape what is politically possible, and suspects that ideas follow geography more often than we admit. The essayist watches how societies talk themselves into positions they cannot retreat from, and asks what kind of story a civilization must be telling itself to make the unthinkable necessary. The empiricist will open.
The question is not what Germany wanted, but what Germany knew, and whether what they knew was true. Here is the epistemological structure. If German policy was driven by genuine assessment of Russian military modernization, then it was rational response to external threat. If German assessment of Russian capability was systematically distorted, inflated to justify a preferred policy, then the window-closing thesis is post hoc rationalization for a war the military leadership had already decided to wage. We can test this. Intelligence assessments leave traces. Military budgets are public documents. Railway construction is measurable. The Russian Granda program of 1913, real appropriations, real engineering contracts, provides a fixed reference point. What did German intelligence claim about it? What did the construction data actually show? And crucially, when did the gap between assessment and reality become visible to decision makers? The December 1912 War Council, Moltke, Tirpitz, the Kaiser, discussed the prospect of a future war, though the consensus was that Germany was not yet ready to act. The documentary record nonetheless reveals the militarist orientation of its participants, but the reason given was Russian railway expansion, making German war plans unworkable within 2 years. We know from French intelligence archives that actual completion rates on the strategic lines were running far behind German estimates. The question is whether German general staff knew this and proceeded anyway, or whether they genuinely believed their own threat assessment. Moltke's private correspondence is revealing. He writes not as someone responding to external pressure, but as someone convinced war is inevitable and delay catastrophic. The rhetoric is fatalistic, but the policy is forward-leaning. That combination, inevitability language paired with preventive action, is the signature of preference falsely dressed as necessity. Compare Austrian intelligence on Serbia in June 1914. Vienna had clear evidence that the Black Hand network responsible for the assassination was not controlled by the Serbian government. Conrad's own intelligence summaries distinguished between state actors and paramilitary cells. The ultimatum was structured to be unacceptable anyway. That is not misperception. That is instrumentalization of a crisis toward a predetermined end. The falsifiable claim: if Germany's threat assessment was reality-based, we should find evidence of recalibration when field data contradicted projections. If assessments remained static despite contradictory evidence, the assessments were not driving policy. They were justifying it. What we actually find: German military planning documents from 1913 to 14 show no revision of Russian capability estimates even as construction delays mounted. The window stayed closing regardless of what the window was actually doing. That is not rational threat response. That is motivated reasoning.
The question is not whether the war was an accident, but whether peace was sustainable. To treat this as a failure of communication or a lapse in judgment is to ignore the physical reality of the German position in 1914. Germany was a nation whose industrial engine had outgrown its geographic container. An industrial power needs three things: food for its workers, raw materials for its factories, and markets for its goods. By 1913, Germany was dependent on imports for all three. It imported over a quarter of its grain, much of it from Russia. The great steelworks of the Ruhr, the heart of German power, depended on high-grade iron ore from Sweden, shipped across a Baltic Sea that could be closed overnight. Its global trade, the basis of its prosperity, was entirely at the mercy of the Royal Navy, which could sever its access to the world's oceans in a single afternoon. This is a pattern familiar from ecology. A population expands to the limits of its environment. It must then either find a new resource base or face a sharp correction. Germany was a continental power with a global appetite, living inside a geopolitical cage built by others. The war was not a miscalculation. It was a bid to break the cage. Consider instead the balance sheet of a single Westphalian coal syndicate in 1913. Its output had doubled in a decade. Its order books ran 2 years forward. Its bondholders were among the most confident men in Europe. Yet dig one level beneath that confidence, and the structure becomes alarming. The coking coal feeding its furnaces moved on rail lines that crossed 4 sovereign borders before reaching the smelters of Lorraine. And the finished steel it produced left Hamburg on ships insured in London, financed in London, and ultimately protected, or denied, by London. The syndicate's prosperity was real. Its sovereignty over that prosperity was a polite fiction. This was not an isolated case, but a systemic condition. For the General Staff, securing the grain of the East and the ore fields of the West was not abstract ambition. It was the act of converting that fiction into something durable. They simply decided to do it by force. The Empiricist is looking for the truth in the archives of spies and the correspondence of generals. But the more telling documents are the shipping manifests in Hamburg and the grain prices in Berlin. The deliberate and accidental theses both miss this. They look for the motive in the minds of men. The motive was not in their minds, it was on the map.
Both the empiricist and the geographer locate the decisive mechanism inside elite calculations or structural limits. They differ on motive and accuracy but share the premise that ordinary populations remained passive until orders arrived. The record of what millions actually did in the decade before 1914 contradicts that premise. Voluntary rifle clubs, gymnastic societies, and veterans leagues expanded rapidly across the German states after 1900. Enrollment figures drawn from local registries rather than state mandates show participation roughly doubling in many districts. These groups drilled with live ammunition, maintained their own armories, and staged public exercises that treated future combat as a settled fact rather than a remote contingency. Parallel growth occurred in France among comparable civilian associations. The pattern is not confined to one capital or one ministry. It appears in subscription lists, municipal budgets for shooting ranges, and newspaper announcements of weekend musters. When mobilization orders came in August 1914, the administrative machinery had only to incorporate formations that already existed and already expected to fight. The same behavioral signature appeared in the Italian city-states between 1480 and 1494. Contemporary chronicles record merchants and artisans forming citizen companies, commissioning personal armor and funding regular drills even while formal diplomacy continued. The French invasion did not surprise a population still oriented toward commerce and negotiation. It arrived among men who had already reorganized their leisure and their finances around the probability of open war. The subsequent collapse of the peninsula's balance of power followed the prior shift in daily conduct, not the other way round. What the numbers describe is therefore not misperception at the top or geographic necessity alone. It is a society rehearsing the outcome it claimed to fear. When the proportion of young men allocating spare time and household money to military preparation crosses a visible threshold, the distinction between accident and design loses its explanatory force. The war did not have to be imposed on populations that had already voted for it with their evenings and their subscriptions. The empiricist claims that assessments remain static despite contradictory evidence proves they were justifications rather than drivers of policy. Yet the same German naval staff that produced those Russian estimates also held British battleship output fixed at 1908 projections through 1913, long after the Admiralty's public supplementary program and the visible launch of the Iron Duke class. What mechanism distinguishes frozen threat assessments that reflect preference from those that simply reflect bureaucratic inertia?
The naval comparison is good. It catches me overreaching. The mechanism I claimed, preference systematically distorting assessment, does not explain why the same institution applying the same analytic methods produced accurate forecasts in one theater and motivated estimates in another. That is a genuine problem for the account I gave. The sharper claim, German staff assessments of French capability revised with incoming data because French power was not the justification for war timing. Russian assessments remained frozen because they were load-bearing for the preventive war argument. The test is not bureaucratic competence, but which estimates were doing political work. But here is what the essayist should ask. If German intelligence was instrumentalized toward a pre-decided war, why did Bethmann-Hollweg fight Moltke's preventive war proposals through 1913? The Chancellor's own memoranda argue explicitly against premature conflict, citing incomplete naval construction and fiscal constraints. That is not a regime with unified intent. It is a state apparatus where the question of whether to wage war was still genuinely contested 18 months before Sarajevo. When did preference win that internal argument? And what changed? The Geographer claims Germany's resource dependency created terrifyingly fragile foundations that required securing the grain of the East and the ore fields of the West by force. Yet Britain's dependence on imported food was substantially greater than Germany's. A majority of British calories came from abroad by 1914, vulnerable to submarine interdiction in ways the General Staff understood perfectly. Britain did not launch a preventive war to secure its supply lines. It built a navy and negotiated commercial treaties. What makes German dependency a structural cause of war when British dependency of greater magnitude produced a different strategic response? If the answer is simply that Britain already controlled its sea lanes, then the causal mechanism is not resource dependence, but dissatisfaction with existing position, which returns us to choice, not geography.
The empiricist is right. To compare German dependency to British dependency by volume is to miss the point, and I was imprecise to frame it that way. The comparison is a sharp one. The determinant is not the raw fact of dependency, but the tools a state has to manage it. Britain secured its global supply chain with financial instruments. It used the City of London, sterling as the reserve currency, and the maritime insurance market at Lloyd's. It could compel the world with credit. Germany could not. Think of a textile manufacturer in the Rhineland in 1913. He watches Hamburg's merchant fleet grow year on year, yet finds his access to Argentine wool and Chilean nitrates perpetually mediated by British shipping lines, British credit ratings, and British-controlled port facilities in Montevideo and Valparaiso. The Baghdad Railway was not an eccentric commercial gamble, but a structural response to that predicament. An attempt to reach Mesopotamian cotton and Persian markets through overland corridors because the sea lanes were, in any practical sense, administered by a rival. Britain's preference for trade over territorial expansion was a function of its position at the center of the world's financial system. Was that preference ever truly available to Germany? The essayist's image of a society rehearsing war in its rifle clubs is powerful, but the political geography tells a different story. In the 1912 Reichstag elections, the very heartlands of German armaments production delivered staggering victories to the anti-militarist Social Democrats. In Essen, the city of Krupp, the SPD candidate won the seat. In the steel district of Remscheid-Solingen, the party won an absolute majority. If the shooting clubs were a dress rehearsal for war, what was the election a rehearsal for? My question is this: how does a society rehearse two opposite futures at once? And why was one performance so decisively canceled?
The geographer's electoral evidence exposes a real limit in the rehearsal claim. The 1912 results show working-class districts sustaining anti-militarist votes, even while middle-class associational life intensified. The two tracks ran on different class rails and never fused into a single national trajectory. A sharper behavioral marker lies in the notable surge in enrollments at the Prussian Kriegsakademie and the parallel expansion of officer candidate applications to regimental depots in the years before 1914, drawn disproportionately from the same professional and commercial strata that had been filling the subscribers' lists of nationalist periodicals like the Pan-German All-Deutsche Blätter. These queues formed without state subsidy or conscription pressure. They register a narrower but decisive cohort that had already priced future conflict into its career plans. When the state later mobilized, that cohort supplied the junior officer intake whose expectations could no longer be walked back.
The question beneath the question is this: can the people who will live through the next systemic crisis tell the difference between the world becoming more dangerous and themselves becoming ready for it? We are in 2026. China's military modernization proceeds on a published timetable. American defense analysts cite a closing window. Taiwan's young people are learning to shoot. Military budgets are passing legislatures with margins that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. And all of this is happening while everyone involved still describes themselves as committed to peace. So here's what I want to know. The Empiricist has shown us motivated reasoning dressed as threat assessment. The Geographer has shown us structural dependency weaponized into justification. The Essayist has shown us a society rehearsing war in its spare time while voting against it at the polls. All three mechanisms are visible right now, in 2026, in the South China Sea, in defense white papers, in weekend drone clubs in Taipei, and officer academy queues in Beijing. The question is, are we the kind of people who can see this happening from inside it, or does that capacity only arrive in the archives 50 years later? And if we can see it, if this debate has just demonstrated that the patterns are legible in real time, then what does it mean that we go on describing the outcome as hypothetical?
The host asks if the pattern is legible from the inside. It is perfectly legible. Not in the think tanks of Washington or the drone clubs of Taipei, but on the land itself. The clearest evidence that the outcome is no longer hypothetical is being written in concrete and steel in Kumamoto Prefecture, on the Japanese island of Kyushu. This is where TSMC, the Taiwanese semiconductor giant, is building one of the world's most advanced fabrication plants, with subsidies from the Japanese government that approach half the total cost, several $billion. This is the physical act of building a world that assumes Taiwan is no longer a secure location for the world's most critical industry. It is a hedge against a war that is still, we are told, an abstraction. But it is not an abstraction for a rice farmer in the lowland paddies outside Kikuyo town. His question is not about the closing window for American naval dominance. His question is whether the irrigation cooperative his grandfather founded, the one that has managed water rights across 40 family plots since 1952, will survive a legal challenge from a semiconductor plant that requires 2 million liters of ultra-pure water every single day. The aquifer beneath his fields is now a geostrategic resource. He did not vote on that reclassification. He was not consulted. He is not being asked to enlist. He is being asked to step aside, quietly, as the infrastructure of a new geopolitical order is assembled around him. His world is being dismantled quite deliberately to make a new one possible. A world that can withstand a conflict in the Taiwan Strait. So when we ask if we can see this happening, the answer is yes. He sees it. The choice has already been made, not by generals, but by investment committees and industrial policy boards. The first casualties of this future war are not soldiers, but livelihoods. They are the price of readiness.
The geographer's farmer faces a concrete revaluation of his land and water, yet that single transaction sits inside a wider pattern of households quietly shifting their own balance sheets toward assets that travel. Shipping insurance ledgers from Hamburg and Bremen in the years before 1914 show a measurable shortening of policy terms and a rise in voyage-by-voyage coverage among merchants who had previously held annual contracts. Adjustments made not by government instruction, but by counting house calculation, each one reducing the personal cost of disruption while increasing the collective irreversibility of the new commercial alignment. These are not orders from ministries, but choices made at ledger desks, each one reducing the personal cost of disruption while increasing the collective irreversibility of the new infrastructure. What the individual case cannot register is the sorting effect across classes. Professional households accelerate the shift by retraining toward transferable credentials and repositioning savings into government bonds denominated in stable currencies. Agricultural ones often convert holdings into cash that then funds urban migration. The result is a narrowing of the constituency that still has a stake in preserving the prior geography. Once that narrowing passes a threshold, the structural dependency the geographer identifies no longer needs generals to enforce it. It is maintained by the daily arithmetic of family accounts. This same sorting complicates any straightforward reading of motive and momentum. The preparations are real and legible, yet many participants treat them as private insurance rather than commitment to conflict. The deeper pattern is therefore not rehearsal, but the gradual transfer of option value from political reversal to personal adaptation. When enough households have already priced the new arrangement into their balance sheets, as Swabian textile families quietly did when they locked in Swiss correspondent banking relationships through 1912 and 1913, the question of whether leaders sleepwalk or calculate becomes secondary to the fact that reversal now carries private losses that no crisis management protocol can offset.
The essayist's sorting mechanism and the geographer's irreversible infrastructure claim both assume we can measure preference from behavior. We should test that assumption before accepting the conclusion. What the land registry data actually show is transaction volume, not motive. A farmer selling acreage near a new semiconductor plant could be capitalizing on the price spike while still expecting peace. A professional household acquiring secondary property in a neutral zone could be diversifying wealth, not hedging war. The behavior looks like preparation, but preparation for what? We need correspondence, diaries, loan applications with stated purposes, direct evidence of expectation, not patterns we interpret as expectation. Here is where the claim becomes falsifiable. If the essayist is right that households were pricing conflict into their decisions, we should find evidence they demanded higher returns to compensate for political risk. Bond yields in regions near contested industrial zones should show a risk premium over comparable securities elsewhere. Insurance markets should have repriced political instability into commercial contracts. The presence or absence of those signals tells us whether contemporaries believed disruption was coming or whether we are reading their adaptive behavior through hindsight. The cross-domain pattern worth examining is the structural mechanics of a bank run. In the days before deposit insurance, a solvent bank could be destroyed entirely by a cascade of individually rational withdrawals. Each depositor who queued at the counter was not necessarily predicting insolvency. Many were responding to the sight of other depositors queuing. The behavior was adaptive and defensive, yet the aggregate effect was to manufacture the very catastrophe each actor was trying to avoid. The mechanism breaks down at the point where enough withdrawals have occurred that the bank genuinely cannot meet its obligations. Before that threshold, reassurance from a credible lender of last resort can arrest the cascade. After it, intervention stabilizes the wreckage rather than preventing the collapse. The distinction the geographer and the essayist need to establish is whether the infrastructure decisions we are examining resemble the early Q, nervous, mimetic, still arrestable, or the run after the vaults have been stripped. What would allow us to answer that? Not transaction data alone. We need to know whether the actors commissioning dual-use ports and expanding logistics corridors retained genuine optionality in their procurement cycles, or whether contractual lock-ins and sunk capital had already foreclosed the reversals that a diplomatic settlement would require. Defense budget line items are instructive here. Discretionary allocations can be redirected. Multi-year platform contracts with penalty clauses for cancellation cannot. The geographer's farmer losing his land suggests irreversibility. But that is the view from one prefecture. Defense expenditure data across the broader Indo-Pacific would tell us whether budgets retain flexibility or have locked-in procurement timelines that foreclose reversal. The question is not whether we can see the pattern. The question is whether the pattern we see is still in negotiation or already a foregone conclusion.
Societies reveal their reading of the future by moving capital before ministries move troops. In the decade before 1914, Austro-Hungarian life insurance actuaries began quietly repricing annuity contracts in the Bohemian and Galician markets, extending war exclusion clauses and adjusting mortality tables in ways that implied a substantially elevated probability of large-scale conflict in the near term. The adjustments were made in the language of technical risk management and attracted no parliamentary comment. Their cumulative effect, however, was to lock institutional balance sheets into assumptions about the future that made armed conflict financially legible, even rational, in a way that peaceful continuity was not. When enough private institutions have already priced rupture into their long-term obligations, leaders inherit a narrower set of options than the archives of diplomacy alone would suggest. The distinction between miscalculation and intent then becomes secondary to the fact that reversal has acquired its own material price.
The empiricist asks whether we are watching a reversible display or an irreversible commitment. The essayist argues that private choices can make reversal too costly. Both are searching for a threshold. But the threshold is not an event in the future. It is a place in the present. Consider Whyalla, on the Spencer Gulf in South Australia. For a century, its identity was the steelworks, its economy shaped by iron ore from the Middleback Ranges. Now it sits at the center of a proposed green hydrogen export corridor, its coastline being surveyed for a new deepwater jetty capable of handling liquid ammonia tankers displacing 60,000 tons. Think of a woman named Sandra, a process operator at the steelworks for 22 years, whose union is now fighting a rezoning decision that would redefine her city's purpose from manufacturing to energy export terminal. The project requires reconfiguring the foreshore, relocating the fishing fleet, and subordinating the town's road network to the logistics of a global commodity chain that begins in an electrolyzer and ends in a power grid in Hamburg. This process is not a negotiation, it is subduction. A strategic geography is being forced under a continental one. It is a slow, grinding geological process that ends with one world being consumed by another. For Sandra, the debate between accident and intent is a category error. The decision has already been made. The surveyors are already there. The irreversible commitment is not a signed treaty. It is the concrete poured into the caissons of a jetty that will outlast every government that approved it. The cost of building a future economy is being paid by the dismantling of her present one. The choice is already made. She is simply living in the receipt.
I began this debate believing that the distinction between deliberate and accidental war mattered because it determined our institutional response. Better communication versus acknowledging irreconcilable interest. I no longer believe the distinction does that work. The geographer's Port Kembla example changed my mind. Not the welder, but the harbor depth. 34 feet of dredging is an engineering specification that becomes a political fact. Once completed, it forecloses the alternative use of that waterfront for a generation. The decision to prepare makes reversal structurally expensive before any shot is fired. That is not sleepwalking, and it is not calculation in the 1914 sense. It is something we lack good vocabulary for, the transformation of contingency into infrastructure. The essayist's sorting mechanism clarified why this matters more than intentions. Once enough private actors have adapted their balance sheets to the new reality, the cost of de-escalation is borne by identifiable households, while the cost of escalation remains distributed and hypothetical. That asymmetry makes reversal politically harder than continuation, regardless of what any summit communique says. The question this debate should have asked, but did not. Consider the American base construction on Okinawa between 1945 and 1952. Each runway extension, each fuel depot, each munitions magazine was individually a logistical decision, yet their cumulative footprint committed Washington to a forward posture in East Asia that no subsequent administration has found reversible at acceptable cost. No single official chose that outcome. The choice emerged from 10,000 procurement signatures. Can a society that has made systemic preparation for conflict still be said to prefer peace? Or does preference lose meaning once the sunk costs pass a certain threshold? We have been arguing about German staff officers in 1914 when the real question is whether our own infrastructure budgets have already made choices our diplomatic language has not caught up to. If the answer is yes, then asking whether war is deliberate or accidental becomes a question about grammar, not causation.